Today, Massachusetts Secretary of State William Galvin announced that he is launching an investigation into the sale of those bonds to the residents of the Bay State. His office sent letters to Fidelity Investments, Oppenheimer Funds and UBS, inquiring about what fund managers knew about the safety of the island's bonds and when they knew it, whether it was before selling them to investors in that state.
Well, joining us to talk more about Puerto Rico's looming debt crisis and how it might affect your investments is Candice Lee. She's Associate Municipal Credit Analyst at Morningstar. Candice, welcome. How many municipal bond funds have Puerto Rican debt in them, and who's got the most?
Well, thanks for having me. Based on our latest numbers available to Morningstar, we found that there are over 400 open-end mutual funds with exposure to Puerto Rico debt, and the aggregate market value of that exposure is roughly $16 billion.
Puerto Rico's had trouble for some time now, so why would these funds buy that debt? I assume they're reaching for a yield, for an interest rate that's much higher than they can get elsewhere. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I mean, Puerto Rico has been facing some pretty severe fiscal strains for a number of years. Their economy has been contracting since 2006. Unemployment's still very high. But at the same time, despite all these strains, they have been able to maintain an investment-grade rating, but have traded at relatively attractive yields compared to other municipal bonds. In addition, they also offer a triple tax exempt benefit, which has been very attractive to U.S. investors, in that the interest income from Puerto Rico bonds is exempt from federal, state, as well as local income taxes where they exist.
As I understand it, Candice, a lot of the muni bond funds that have large slugs of Puerto Rican debt in them are off a lot this year, and that presumes that investors are marking down those prices on the possibility of a default. How do you handicap the possibility of a default? And how should I, if I invest in a municipal bond fund, at what level does the exposure to those bonds become troublesome?
Yeah, so first I would preface by saying that there's a lot of different types of Puerto Rico debt. What's generally been talked about has been the Commonwealth General Obligation bonds, which actually have a constitutional guarantee on that debt repayment. So the Puerto Rico Constitution actually stipulates that payment of that debt supersedes in priority the payment of current payroll expenditures as well as current pension obligations. And they also have the flexibility to reclaim other revenue sources.
So if it's a general obligation, excuse me for interrupting, if it's a general obligation bond, you're going to get paid.
That's what their Constitution is promising. And, the government has made a number of statements, confirming that they're diligent about, their commitment to repaying that debt. Now, this doesn't necessarily soften the severe amount of stress that they're currently facing still, however. So as an investor, I would probably want, if I'm invested in general obligation bonds, I'd probably want to hold shorter term bonds than the longer term ones, because we just don't know how the economy may or may not further deteriorate, further out into the future.
Right. So if default is not the likely outcome, what about a downgrade, though? And what would that do to the value of those bonds and to the portfolios that hold it?
Yeah, so a downgrade is certainly something that we don't rule out the possibility of. To my knowledge right now, all the credit rating agencies have negative outlooks on Puerto Rico, citing concerns about the very weak economy and whether Puerto Rico will manage to bring in the revenues that they're budgeting for this year. Should a downgrade happen, I think this will probably exacerbate the Puerto Rico bond sell-off that we've already been seeing so far. Recently Moody's downgraded sales tax bonds in Puerto Rico, and already we've seen that the yields for those bonds have jumped up quite significantly. So certainly I think that the market activity that we're seeing now would be further exacerbated if a downgrade were to happen.
Candice, this has been very helpful. I guess the bottom line here is that even if you own just a mutual fund, it's not just a mutual fund, it's a collection of individual securities, and you better know what's in your fund, right, Candice?
Absolutely. We always reiterate that due diligence at the investor level is extremely important. We've seen that there are a lot of single state muni funds, especially some from Oppenheimer, Nuveen, Rochester, some of these single state muni funds that have a significant exposure to Puerto Rico, sometimes 20, 30%, and they've suffered some pretty significant losses year to date because of that exposure.
Candice, thank you very much. Candice Lee is an Associate Municipal Credit Analyst at Morningstar.